I always loved silence, but that evening it felt too heavy, as if the air in our old Savannah townhouse had thickened with the anticipation of something inevitable. My wife, Eleanor, had left for a conference in Charleston, leaving me alone for an entire week. I planned to spend it grading student essays, sipping strong coffee, and maybe listening to old jazz records I hadn't touched in years. But when I heard the key turn in the lock, followed by my son Julian's voice echoing through the hallway, I knew my plans were about to collapse. His arrival was unexpected, like a flash of lightning on a clear day, and something in his tone, bold, almost challenging, made my heart beat faster than I was ready to admit. My name is Marcus Tate. I'm 47 years old. I live in Savannah, Georgia. I was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of papers, when Julian walked in, casually tossing his backpack onto the floor. He looked different, not the lanky kid I'd sent off to college 2 years ago. Now he was taller, more confident, with this new, almost commanding aura that made me feel uneasy. His dark hair fell over his forehead, and his smile seemed too bright for our dimly lit kitchen. He said he'd decided to come home for the week because of some break in his college schedule. I nodded, trying not to look at him too long, but his presence already filled the house with an energy I didn't know how to shield myself from. We talked about small things. His dance classes, my lectures, how Eleanor was probably discussing 18th century art with her colleagues. But something in the way he spoke, the way he leaned just a little closer than necessary, made me nervous. I offered to make dinner to keep my hands busy and my mind distracted. Julian agreed, but instead of going to his room, he stayed, leaning against the counter, watching me as I chopped vegetables. His questions were innocent. How's work? Do I miss my younger days? But there was a spark in them, like he was testing how far he could push. When we sat down to eat, he told me about his latest performance, how the audience gave a standing ovation. His eyes lit up as he described every step, every movement, and I caught myself listening too closely. I took a sip of wine, hoping it would calm the strange warmth starting to spread inside me. After dinner, he suggested watching a movie, but I declined, claiming I was tired. I retreated to my study, closed the door, and tried to focus on student essays, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. His laugh, the way he looked at me across the table. I didn't understand what was happening to me, but it scared me more than I could put into words. Something in his bright smile hid a secret, and I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover it. I woke up the next morning feeling like the house no longer belonged to me alone. Julian was already in the kitchen, humming something under his breath while brewing coffee. His presence, so vibrant and effortless, seemed to fill every corner, and I caught myself thinking I couldn't stop looking at him. He was in an old t-shirt that lifted slightly when he reached for a mug, and I quickly looked away, feeling my cheeks start to burn. I told myself it was just fatigue, that I was overthinking, but deep down, I knew it was something more, something I didn't want to put into words. We sat down for breakfast, and Julian started talking about his latest dance project. His voice was full of energy, his hands moving as he described how the music guided every step. I tried to focus on my food, but his enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself smiling when he mentioned nearly falling during a rehearsal. He caught my eye and winked, like we were sharing some secret. It was a small thing, but my heart skipped, and I quickly took a sip of coffee to hide the awkwardness. Why did his smile make me feel like a teenager facing something forbidden for the first time? By lunchtime, I suggested ordering pizza, hoping the normalcy of the gesture would ground me. Julian agreed, but instead of sitting across from me, he pulled his chair closer. As we ate, he talked about college, his friends, the parties where he danced until dawn. His hand brushed mine when he reached for a napkin, and he didn't pull away right away. I froze, unsure how to react, and he just smiled, like nothing had happened. It was too much. His closeness, his scent, his voice. I mumbled something about work and retreated to my study, closing the door a little harder than necessary. That evening, I decided to cook something special to distract myself. Julian offered to help, and we ended up shoulder to shoulder at the stove. He joked, tasting the sauce from a spoon, and at one point, his fingers lightly grazed mine as he handed me the spices. I felt the warmth of his skin linger on my hand, and it was so intimate, so wrong, that I nearly dropped the bowl. He noticed my reaction and laughed, but there was something in his eyes that made me wonder, did he know what he was doing? I tried to change the subject, asking about his plans for the future, but he answered vaguely, turning the conversation to me, to the dreams I'd buried for a stable life. When we sat down to dinner, he was too close again, his knee lightly touching mine under the table. I tried not to notice, but every look, every word felt like part of a dance I didn't want to join but couldn't stop. After dinner, he suggested a walk, but I declined, citing a pile of ungraded essays. I retreated to my study, but even there, his voice, his laugh, seemed to follow me. Something in his boldness scared me, and I didn't know how far he was willing to go. I couldn't sleep that night, tossing in bed until the clock showed 2 in the morning. The silence of the house felt deceptive, like it was hiding something I didn't want to face. Finally, I decided to go downstairs for a glass of water, hoping movement would settle my thoughts. But as I passed through the living room, the dim glow of the television stopped me. Julian was on the couch, curled under a blanket, watching a movie. On the screen, 2 men danced in low light, their movements so close, so raw, that I felt the air in the room thicken. I froze in the doorway, unsure whether to leave or stay, and then he turned his head and saw me. He didn't look surprised, just smiled and patted the couch beside him. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, when he said he couldn't sleep and found this old movie on a streaming service. I wanted to leave, to say I needed sleep, but his gaze, calm and inviting, held me in place. I sat on the other end of the couch, trying to keep my distance, but his presence still felt too close. The movie played on, and I tried to focus on the plot, but the scenes were heavy with tension, looks, touches, unspoken words. I could feel my heart beating faster, and I hated myself for it. Julian spoke suddenly, eyes still on the screen. He asked if I'd watched movies like this when I was younger. His tone was casual, but the question felt like a test. I mumbled something about how such films weren't shown in my childhood, but he just chuckled, like he knew more than I was willing to admit. He turned to me, his knee brushing mine, and asked if I thought there was something freeing about these stories. I didn't know how to answer, feeling his words cut deeper than I wanted. I said it was just a movie, but my voice sounded shaky, and I was sure he noticed. We sat in silence for a while, and I tried to focus on anything but him. But then he reached for the remote, and his hand grazed my palm. It was fleeting, but the warmth of his skin lingered on mine, like a mark I couldn't erase. He apologized, but there was no regret in his eyes, just something I couldn't read. I stood, muttering that I needed to sleep, and practically fled the room. In my bedroom, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. His invitation to stay, his gaze, his accidental touch, everything swirled in my head like a melody I couldn't forget. I climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I thought about how he looked at me, how the movie mirrored something I'd buried years ago. It scared me, but it also pulled at me, like a magnet I didn't know how to resist. Something in his quiet confidence made me feel like my walls were crumbling, and I wasn't sure I could hold them up. The morning after that midnight scene in the living room started with a heavy feeling, like I'd overslept something important. I went downstairs to the kitchen, hoping coffee would bring me clarity, but Julian was already there, standing by the stove in just shorts. His skin gleamed in the morning light pouring through the window, and I felt my gaze linger on him longer than it should have. He turned, caught my eye, and smiled in a way that felt like he knew what I was thinking. I mumbled something about the weather and turned to the coffee maker, trying not to notice how his ease seemed almost deliberate, like he wanted me to look. We sat at the table and he started talking about his day, rehearsals, a new dance he was working on. His voice was light, but every time he leaned over to grab toast or pass me the jam, his movements felt too smooth, too close. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind kept drifting to last night, the movie, his hand on mine, how I'd fled, unable to handle what I felt. I asked if he wanted to go to town for groceries, hoping a change of scenery would help, but he just shrugged and said he was fine staying home. His eyes, though, looked at me like he was waiting for me to say something more. After breakfast, I retreated to my study, closed the door, and tried to dive into work. But instead of student essays, I found myself digging through an old drawer where I kept my journals from my youth. I hadn't opened them in years, but something pulled me to them, like I was searching for answers. The pages were filled with entries about dreams I'd abandoned, feelings I'd suppressed to fit the expectations of family and society. I read about a guy from college whose smile once made my heart race, and how I'd convinced myself it meant nothing. Closing the journal, I felt the past and present collide, and it was too much to bear. I decided to take a walk to clear my head, but when I got back, Julian was in the living room, sprawled on the couch with a book. He looked up and asked if I wanted to come to his rehearsal today. His tone was so casual, but there was something in his gaze that made me agree, even though I knew it was a bad idea. I said I'd think about it and went back to my study, but his invitation stayed with me, like an echo. I tried to work, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. His movements, his smile, his confidence that was breaking down my defenses. By lunch, I realized I couldn't hide behind papers anymore. I went to the kitchen, where Julian was making sandwiches, and told him I'd go with him to the rehearsal. He nodded, like he'd expected it, and his smile was so warm it made me feel both safe and in danger. Something in his quiet confidence made me feel like I was standing on the edge, and I didn't know what I'd find if I took a step forward. I didn't know what to expect when I agreed to go with Julian to his dance rehearsal, but even in the car, I felt tension tightening my chest. He sat beside me, humming along to the radio, and his ease only heightened my unease. When we arrived at the studio, a large building with high windows in downtown Savannah, I hoped the crowd of dancers and the noise of music would distract me from thoughts I didn't want to acknowledge. But stepping into the hall, I realized it would be harder than I thought. Julian peeled off his hoodie, leaving just a fitted tank top, and his confident movements instantly drew my eyes, like I couldn't look at anything else. The rehearsal started, and I sat in the corner, trying to look like just a dad supporting his son. But when Julian stepped into the center of the floor, everything else faded. His body moved with such grace, such power, that I felt my breathing grow uneven. The music was slow, with deep bass, and every step, every turn felt like part of a story he told without words. I noticed other dancers watching him with admiration, and it only intensified the strange feeling inside me, a mix of pride and something I didn't want to name. At one point, he glanced my way, and our eyes met. His smile was faint but felt personal, like he was dancing just for me. I looked away, pretending to check my phone, but my heart pounded so loudly I worried someone might hear. After the piece, he walked over, wiping sweat from his face with a towel, and asked what I thought. I mumbled something about how impressive his movements were, but my voice sounded strained, and I was sure he noticed. He laughed and said he wanted to show me another dance if I stayed until the end. I stayed, though I knew I should have left. The second dance was a duet, and I watched as Julian moved with his partner, their bodies so close I felt a pang I couldn't explain. His hands slid along her waist, their movements fluid, almost intimate, and I caught myself imagining myself in her place. The thought was so sudden, so wrong, that I clenched my fist to snap back to reality. When the dance ended, he came over again, his breathing heavy, his eyes bright with energy. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee at a nearby cafe to talk. We sat at a table in the small cafe, and he talked about his passion for dance, how he felt free on stage. His words were so genuine that I relaxed despite myself, but every time his hand brushed mine as he gestured, I felt warmth spread through me. I tried to talk about something neutral, the weather, his studies, but his gaze, so open and warm, made it impossible. When we got home, he said he was glad I came, and his voice was so soft it felt like my walls were crumbling again. What did he mean to say over coffee, and why couldn't I stop thinking about his look? After the rehearsal, I felt like I was balancing on a thin thread that could snap at any moment. Julian was in high spirits, humming a tune from his dance as we drove home, and his energy only deepened my unease. I told myself I needed to pull it together, to get back to normal life. Work, essays, the role of a father who doesn't lose his head. But when we got home, and he offered to help with some minor repairs in the living room, I realized the distance between us was shrinking, and it scared me more than I was ready to admit. A shelf in the living room had been wobbly for ages, and I decided to fix it, hoping physical work would distract me. Julian insisted on helping, and soon we were standing side by side, surrounded by tools and wooden planks. He held the shelf steady while I screwed in bolts, and his closeness was so tangible I could feel the warmth of his body even through the air between us. At one point, he leaned down to pick up a dropped screw, and his shoulder brushed mine. He laughed, saying I must be strong to handle the repair so easily. His voice was warm, almost playful, and I felt my cheeks burn from the simple compliment. I tried to focus on the task, but his movements, how he handed me the hammer, how his fingers grazed mine, felt like part of a dance I couldn't stop. When the shelf was done, he stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans, and said we made a good team. His smile was so open, so genuine, that I smiled back despite myself, but inside, a storm was raging. I said I'd make some tea and went to the kitchen to catch my breath. But even there, his presence seemed to follow me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. That night, I sat in my study with a glass of whiskey, trying to drown out thoughts that were getting louder. I kept replaying his touch, his laugh, his look in the studio, and every image was like a spark igniting something I'd tried to bury. I told myself it was wrong, that I had to stop, but a part of me, the part I'd suppressed for decades, wanted to know what it would feel like to give in. I finished the whiskey and stared at the old books on my shelf, but instead motes of dust floated in the air instead of words. I saw only his face, his movements, his confidence that was breaking down my defenses. Before bed, I passed by his room, and the door was slightly ajar. He was sitting on his bed, scrolling through his phone, and looked up when I paused. He asked if everything was okay, and his voice was so gentle that I felt my walls tremble again. I said I just wanted to say goodnight, but his gaze, full of something I couldn't quite grasp, made me linger a second longer than I should have. I left, closing the door behind me, but his question echoed in my mind. Something in his tone made me think he knew more than he was saying, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what might come next. I spent the entire next day avoiding Julian, hiding behind stacks of essays in my study, but his presence seemed to seep through the walls. By evening, I felt like a taut string, ready to snap at the slightest touch. I decided I needed to talk to him, to set boundaries, to bring things back to normal, to what I understood as normal. But when I left my study, the house was dimly lit, and I found him in my office, sitting on the edge of my desk with one of my old books in his hands. He looked up, and his smile wasn't as bright as usual but deeper, almost challenging, like he'd been waiting for me. He said he'd found a book on queer history I'd taught a few years back and asked why I never talked about those things at home. His voice was calm, but there was a spark in it, like he was trying to reach something I'd kept hidden. I replied that it was just work, that I left academic topics at the university, but he shook his head and said it was more than that. He stood, stepped closer, and I felt the air between us grow heavy, like before a storm. He asked why I was always so reserved, why I hid behind books and duty, and his words struck something inside me I didn't want to touch. I tried to laugh it off, to say he was overthinking, but he stepped even closer, and his gaze was so direct I couldn't look away. He said he saw how I looked at him, that it wasn't just curiosity. I wanted to argue, to say he was wrong, but the words caught in my throat. His hand rose slowly and he touched my cheek, his fingers warm and sure. In that moment, time seemed to stop, and I felt all my defenses crumble. He leaned in, and our lips met, softly, but with a force that made me tremble. It was like a flash, like a moment when you realize you can't go back. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it was filled with everything I'd suppressed for years: desire, fear, freedom. I pulled back, my breathing ragged, and I saw in his eyes a mix of confidence and vulnerability. I mumbled that it was wrong, that we couldn't, and practically fled the room, leaving him standing there. In my bedroom, I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to process what had just happened. His taste lingered on my lips, and I hated myself for how much I liked it. I told myself it was a mistake, that I had to forget, but part of me knew that moment had changed everything. I climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I thought about his words, how he saw me, how his touch had awakened something I thought was long dead. It was both terrifying and alive, like I was feeling truly myself for the first time in years. But what now? How could I face him after this, and what did it mean for us both? The morning after the kiss felt like waking up in a foreign world where everything familiar seemed fragile and ready to shatter. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just a moment of weakness, something I could forget. But the taste of his lips, the warmth of his fingers on my cheek, it was too real, too alive to simply erase. I felt like a traitor, to Eleanor, to myself, to the life I'd so carefully built. When I finally went downstairs, Julian was gone, leaving a note that he'd headed to rehearsal. I was both grateful and crushed by his absence, because I didn't know how to face him after what had happened. I spent the day in my study, diving into work like it was a lifeline. I graded essays, answered emails from colleagues, did anything to avoid thinking about him. But every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside made me flinch, expecting him to return and upend my world again. By noon, I found a ticket to his next dance performance on the kitchen counter, attached to a small note, "Hope you'll come." His handwriting was so familiar, but now every letter felt like part of something bigger, something I couldn't ignore. I hid the ticket in a drawer, as if that could hide my feelings too. That evening, he came back and I heard him in the living room, playing music, the same track from his rehearsal. I stayed in my study, pretending to be busy, but his presence was like a magnet pulling me toward him. I went out to grab water and saw him on the couch, earbuds in, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met. His face was calm, but his eyes held something: pain, hope, expectation. He took off his earbuds and asked if I wanted to listen to a playlist he'd made. His voice was soft, almost pleading, and I felt my heart tighten. I sat beside him, but at a safe distance, and he handed me one earbud. The music was slow, with deep notes that seemed to echo everything I felt: confusion, longing, desire. Our fingers brushed as he adjusted the chord, and it was like an electric shock I couldn't ignore. I wanted to leave, but his closeness, his breathing, his warmth kept me rooted. He started talking about the music, how it made him feel free, and his words were so earnest that I felt my walls begin to crumble again. I watched him, his lips moving as he told a story, and I remembered our kiss, a moment that was both the most wrong and the most right thing in my life. I stood abruptly, muttering that I had work to do, and left him there. In my study, I closed the door and pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to stop the flood of thoughts. His voice, his touch, his gaze, it was all too close, too dangerous. I knew I had to stop this, but part of me wanted to go back, sit beside him, take his hand, and find out what it felt like to be honest with myself. By the evening of the last day before Eleanor's return, I felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or step back. Julian had been home all day, but we barely spoke, exchanging only brief words about mundane things. His presence was like a quiet melody I couldn't ignore, and every glance he sent across the room made my heart tighten. I knew tomorrow would bring everything back to normal, Eleanor would be home, we'd be a family again, but something inside me had cracked, and I wasn't sure I could fix it. Night fell too quickly, and I realized I couldn't keep hiding from what had happened between us. I found Julian in his room, sitting on his bed with a guitar he rarely played. He strummed soft, pensive chords, and the lamplight fell on his face, making his features even more striking. I knocked on the door, and he looked up, his gaze calm but tinged with a longing, like he too knew this was our last night in this strange, fragile bubble. I said I wanted to talk, and he set the guitar aside, gesturing for me to sit beside him. I hesitated, but his voice, so gentle and sincere, made me give in. We sat in silence, and the quiet was heavy, full of unspoken words. He broke it first, asking if I regretted what happened in the study. I wanted to say yes, that it was a mistake, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I admitted I didn't know what I felt, that it scared me but also made me feel alive. His eyes softened, and he slowly took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. It was so simple, so natural, yet so wrong that I felt my breath catch. We didn't move, just held hands, and in that gesture was more closeness than in any conversation we'd had. He leaned closer, and I felt the warmth of his breath on my cheek. We didn't kiss, but his forehead rested against mine, and we stayed like that, as if afraid to break the moment. His voice was barely audible when he said he didn't want me to hide from myself. I closed my eyes, feeling his words sink into me, tearing down the last of my barriers. This wasn't just a moment of tenderness, it was an acknowledgement that something had shifted between us, and we both knew we couldn't pretend it hadn't. I wanted to stay, to sink into that feeling, but the thought of Eleanor, of duty, of the life I'd built, made me pull back. I stood, muttering that I had to go, but his hand held mine a second longer. He didn't say anything, but his gaze said everything. He saw me, the real me, and it was both a comfort and a pain. I went to my room, closed the door and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. I thought of his hand in mine, his words, how close we'd come to crossing another line. What did he want from me, and could I live knowing this night had changed me forever? The morning Eleanor returned was clear, but inside me, a storm raged that I didn't know how to calm. I stood at the stove, brewing coffee, when I heard her suitcase rolling down the hall. She walked in, smiling, with a faint tiredness in her eyes, and hugged me, talking about the conference, the new paintings she'd seen. I nodded, trying to seem engaged, but my mind was elsewhere. In Julian's room, in his gaze last night, in the warmth of his hand in mine. I felt like an actor playing the role of husband, father, a man who knows who he is. But after this week, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Julian came downstairs later, his hair messy, his smile as bright as ever. He hugged Eleanor, chatting about her trip, and I watched him, trying to figure out how he could be so at ease after everything that had happened. We sat down for a family dinner, and Eleanor talked about Charleston, her colleagues, plans for the next exhibit. I responded, joked, poured wine, but every time my eyes met Julian's, I felt something inside me pause. His gaze was steady, but there was a shadow of the moment we'd shared, a silent reminder that our connection hadn't vanished. At one point, Eleanor stepped out to take a call, and we were left alone at the table. Julian leaned in slightly, his voice low as he said he was heading back to college tomorrow. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he added that he hoped I'd come to his next performance. His words were simple, but they carried something more, an invitation, a question, a hope. I said I'd try, but my heart pounded because I knew it wasn't just about the dance. He smiled, and his knee brushed mine under the table, fleeting but enough to send warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. When Eleanor returned, dinner went on, and I played my part, but inside, I was torn. I thought about Julian, how his presence had forced me to face a part of myself I'd buried. I thought about Eleanor, our life, the years we'd spent together. I knew I couldn't destroy that, but I also knew I couldn't pretend nothing had changed. After dinner, I retreated to my study, closed the door, and sat, staring at the ticket to his performance he'd left me. It was a choice, to step toward truth or stay in the safety of the familiar. I didn't make a choice that night, but I realized that question would haunt me. I want to ask you, watching this story, have you ever faced a moment where the truth about yourself threatened to unravel everything you'd built? How did you decide what mattered more, being honest with yourself or holding on to what you have? Write in the comments, because I genuinely want to know how others navigate these crossroads. For me, this week was the start of a journey, and though Julian left, his glance across the table stayed with me, like a promise that I could still find myself, if I dared.